of Planning and Operation of Transport at EMBARQ, Mexico. And I will be your moderator for today. My name is Kristen Tovas, and I'm a consultant at Ruprecht Consult. So just a little overview of our agenda today. First, I'll go through some webinar tips to let you know how you can participate during this webinar. We do welcome your active participation in the form of typed questions and also raising your hand, so I'll show you how to do that. And then we will move on to the presentation by Gustavo. We'll call him Gus. And then at the end, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and for open discussion. So a quick overview on how to use this webinar interface. You can raise your hand if you have a question at any time. That will allow you to ask a spoken question. All participants are muted automatically right now, so we can't hear you until you would raise your hand, and then I could call on you and we could have a spoken question from you. You can also ask questions in written form down in the questions log, and then I will see that and I will ask those questions. I'll interrupt Gus at appropriate moments and ask this question on your behalf. And we will also have some polls today. So when you see these polls come up, this is meant to gain your participation and get some input from you on a few questions that we have. So please just tick the answer that is best for you when those come up. And a quick overview of the Solutions Project. If you would like some more detailed information about the Solutions Project and the other 5 clusters that we're working on related to sustainable mobility, then please visit urban-mobility-solutions.eu. And also this webinar today will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, and the PowerPoint presentation from this webinar will also be uploaded to our website up here so that you can download it. So then, without further ado, I will hand the presentation over now to Gus for his presentation on sustainable public transport.
Thank you, Kristen. And you guys can hear me well, right?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, sounds good.
There you go.
I'm going to show my screen. 1 second. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent.
Cool.
Well, good morning for some, good afternoon for others, or evening. My name is Gustavo Jimenez, and I will be giving the webinar on sustainable transport. And just a quick overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to talk basically about some of the planning issues related to sustainable transportation in emerging economies. We work at EMBARQ Mexico with different governments in Mexico and Latin America to promote sustainable transport project. I don't know if you're familiar with the EMBARQ network, but we are part of the World Resources Institute, which basically promotes sustainable transport across the globe. We have centers in Turkey, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and the US. And we're also hoping to start one in Africa in the next year. So our focus mainly is on public policies that help promote public transport, but we also get working with various governments to implement sustainable transport solutions. Our most iconic program was the first one here in Mexico was the Metrobus transport system, which is the BRT system that got implemented first in Mexico, was the third one in Latin America, and now it's grown and it's been very successful. We're also helping different governments in Mexico and other places to implement BRT systems across their cities. So that said, I will be talking about different concepts on sustainable transport, and mostly concepts related to public transportation systems, because as you know, public transport is one of the better solutions for promoting sustainable cities. Of course, there's other elements in transportation that are also related to sustainable transport, such as the bike sharing programs, the car sharing programs, also sort of the walkability issues in cities, but for this webinar, I'll be focusing on public transport. So with that, I'm going to start talking about the planning culture. I think for a lot of cities in the world that are sort of emerging and have had difficulties sort of getting projects implemented, has to do a lot with the planning culture, right? Because a lot of cities may not have planning departments that have all the capacity to provide all a multimodal plan. So when we talk about planning, we need to articulate the decisions to make the projects happen and to implement it in the reality. What has happened in the past sometimes with the different paradigm that we had on transport, where the car was the main source of mobility for cities, is that even though they were planning for cars, they were not planning and executing these programs in an efficient manner, in an efficient way in some of the emerging economies. So the picture there shows how a bottleneck is generated by just planning for more and more highways. And also, it just tends to, at least in some countries, for example, in Mexico, the financing of these projects typically goes to the car, like very little percentage goes to public transport or other ways of transporting people, such as bike sharing programs or walkability programs or public space programs. So what tends to happen is that the planning is not integrated and it's not multimodal and it doesn't articulate well with the needs, for a sustainable city. So for that to happen, we need to generate an integrated vision for the city. Typically, transport projects in emerging economies are very politically driven. Sort of when a new mayor comes in or a new politician, they tend to really have a vision for the city, but they also tend to want to have like an emblematic project for their cities. And sometimes, while they could be good, sometimes they cannot be integrated with the real vision for the city and may not follow a plan. So one of the key components that we've been pushing different governments to implement here in Mexico is to have a sustainable plan, a sustainable mobility plan that integrates all multimodal elements. So with our work with the federal government here in Mexico, we were able to make sure that before they can get funds, federal funds for a public transport project, they need to have a plan, a multimodal plan that really represents the vision for the city, and really it's designed and tailored to the needs and interests of the city. We have a new paradigm shift in transport. I think it's not prevalent yet, but really if we're going to grow sustainably, we need to think about public transport in a more, it's really the tool that will help us alleviate some of the congestion that some of the cities are experiencing, because as you all know, the capacity for a bus system it's much higher than one for a single occupancy vehicle, but sometimes the planning that goes on really sort of fosters that dependency on the cars and the reliance on these types of modes. So in order to do a good planning scheme, we need to have an organized vision with the different departments of the city, with the different interests of the city, and that's when we think about participative planning. And you may think that participative planning only happens in public space projects, but it could also happen in transport projects. And the idea is to really have that all the stakeholders, specifically the public and private sector, working together to show these solutions. And in the next slides, I'll show you how that happens for BRT systems. Also a long-term vision for the city, right? We sometimes, and that's a picture of Mexico City, my city, the city where I'm speaking from. And when we think about a city, really we have a lot of elements. And as you all know, at least for the experience in Mexico City, we had a huge pollution problem back in the 90s. And the way to mitigate that pollution problem was with basically doing all kinds of things. And one of the most effective policies was that of transportation. Really, the government fostered a few of the elements to disincentivize the use of the car with programs like Hoy No Circula, where your car doesn't ride or doesn't work for 1 day a week, and also really spending some money for better public transport projects. And in some of these public transport projects were, as I was mentioning earlier, the BRT system in Mexico, the Metrobus, which really got rid of a lot of old and beat up vehicles, buses that were very polluting in some of the main avenues in Mexico City, and sort of fostering the new fleet, and a fleet that is a little cleaner, that follows some standards, either Euro or EPA standards, and that really worked. So in order to optimize the infrastructure of the cities, we need to be well organized in the administrative part of the city. So meaning that we have to have strong institutions. And really, when we think about that, we need to make sure we have an integrated planning. We just don't have to think about our city, but we need to think about how our city connects to other cities, how our city provides some of the goods and some of the movements that happen, across the region. So understanding the economic impacts of your city, the spatial integration. Maybe your city has some rocky grounds, or I don't know, but you have to think in a way that is integrated. And the next question, the next picture shows the Bogota plan for the Transmilenio system. As you know, Transmilenio is one of the largest BRT systems in the world, and that's kind of recent, really. It started working back in 2000, and over the next basically 15 years, we've seen the growth of Transmilenio all over Bogota, and really the way it happened was through a strategic land use plan, where really they detected where the growth was going to happen. And as you know, the cities that are emerging, they move really quickly. They change their economic activity. It may have been in the center of the town, but then it may move like a couple of miles to the north or a couple of miles to the south. So the system that you plan and the sustainable transport system that you plan, maybe a BRT system or something else, needs to be flexible enough to really capture the new demands that may be coming from your city. So really, when we think about sustainable transport, you have to integrate it with the land use, because if you don't do that, you may run into the problems of having a bus that is empty. And if you have a bus that is empty, then you have a lot of issues with financial feasibility that really impacts the bottom line for the operators, and then you basically are building a system that will not work. So that's why it's important to have a really good land use understanding, and if possible, a good land use plan, so you grow at the same rate, or you grow in the same places that you're growing your transport system. So the really key component. And for the new cities that are emerging, I think that's a main thing, because they may not have all the administrative instruments to do this integrated planning. But that's one thing that we need to foster in our plans. It is important also to consider a few elements in transport. Typically, you need to see the implications of the actions related to transport for your cities. Like many of the emerging cities, like I'm talking about Sao Paulo, Brazil, Mexico City, even Bogota itself, Peru, Lima, and other cities also in Asia, Chengdu, and then Beijing and others. We're talking about megalopolis, like big regional cities. And the problem that we encounter there is we have multiple administrative areas, and we have different governments, different municipalities, different jurisdictions. So having an integrated plan is very difficult. So when we think about sustainable transport, a regional thinking and a metropolitan thinking needs to come into place. It's also really understanding the role of your city in the whole economic impact of your country and impact of your region. It's important understanding the role that your city may play, and the network in your city. It's also really important for a sustainable plan, because when we talk about sustainable transport, it may go beyond just the real impacts of your city, but it's really regional impacts. And if they're not well coordinated, you may have a good system within one municipality, but if that municipality is with other municipalities, then it may not work. So that concept is really important. Now that technology is coming pretty quickly to this sector of transport, we really need to think beyond, just the actual infrastructure, but think about a system, a transport system that is integrated, that operates efficiently, that has technology tools that can help achieve that. I have a picture there of Metrobus City. That actually got implemented pretty recently. It's been about 2.5 or almost 3 years since that place got implemented, and they started to regulate the operations of the BRT lines in Mexico. We now have 5 BRT lines, and we're going to be moving to having 8 lines by the end of the year. So having these places where you can really integrate it and be productive, sort of operate your system in a more efficient way, it really helps to decrease cost of your fleet and to also increase, the quality of service that you provide to your citizens. We need to ensure that we need to build systems that are adequate and safe, right? So sometimes when we think about public transport, we may think about, oh, well, the buses may not be, may have difficulties, with environment and so on, but also the drivers, if they are not trained for safe driving, they could also present a couple of difficulties for your city. I mean, typically, here in Mexico, unfortunately, we had a few accidents recently where public transport units were involved with several crashes and several fatalities of bicycles and pedestrians. So really having a train sector for those drivers, it's really important. So, yeah.
I think maybe this would actually be a good moment to launch one of our polls where we can find out how many of our participant cities actually have a single transport authority. I think this might be relevant at this moment. And then we can also find out where everyone is from. Since we didn't get to do that at the beginning, it would also be interesting to get your responses to that. So
sure.
First, I'll just ask everyone where you're from so that we first have an idea of where these answers are coming from. So here's our first poll. Please select the continent that you are from. And it looks like 63% have voted. We'll just wait till a few more come in, and then we can show our results immediately. Okay, almost everyone. All right, I'll close the poll and share the results. Wow. Okay, mostly European today, with a few from North or South America.
Okay.
So keeping that in mind then, we can launch the second poll. So does your city have a single transport agency that administers, plans, manages, and operates all transport modes, as Gus was just describing? So please choose the one that most accurately fits your city. Almost everyone has voted. Okay, close the poll. And it looks like the majority actually, they have more than one transport agency, so it's not centralized, as you were describing.
Right. Excellent. So shall we continue?
Yeah, we can continue.
Yeah, thank you so much for the poll, Kristen. So yeah, interesting that a lot of our audience is from Europe, and typically, as you may understand, different emerging economies have different problems with transport, but we share a few problems, specifically that one that we were talking just earlier, that if you don't have an integrated agency that does all the planning, then you may have some problems with how you operate your system, and that's a problem that is shared across the world, really, because our cities grew so fast and they integrated into a whole region that many municipalities just got too small, and then the other municipalities were having their own departments, their own political interests, their own power. So coordinating transport is becoming really complex because you have to deal with a lot of different departments, and that's happening in New York, that's happening in LA, I think that's happening in some cities in Germany, and the way, for example, in Spain, they solved it. Madrid had a similar issue, but they started to integrate their whole system, their whole transport system. The same thing happened in London. So we have some good examples in London and Madrid that were really able to integrate their transport system in a more comprehensive fashion. So we also need to, when we think about sustainable transport, we need to think about multimodal transport. Here I have a picture of people in bicycles. We have the BRT system. We have the car, right? I mean, the car, even though it's not the most sustainable way to move around. It's part of our world. It's part of our city. So we need to integrate in a way that it's consistent with the city. But really, we need to show, if we really want to move towards a more sustainable future, we need to give priority to public transport investment and to non-motorized modes, because that's the history of our world and our profession is in the last 70 years we really invested in the car. So we provide an infrastructure for the car, and now that we have like congested roadways and we are seeing that that's not the solution, really need to work on a government level and an administrative level to deviate those funds towards the sustainable transport funds. Here in Mexico City, for example, and in Guadalajara, Mexico, and also in Bogota, some of the resources that were shared for vehicles are now being shared, part of it, to public transport and bicycle systems. So that's important. Here, the mobility scheme, and I'm going to be talking more about the institutional arrangements that for these departments, is that we need to integrate, as we were saying earlier, land use and mobility, and socioeconomic projections. So in order to do that planning, we need to get a good understanding of how our city is going to work in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, so to be able to adapt our systems, even to adapt our own administrative functions to that. So we need to think about the infrastructure, managing the infrastructure, and we need to have really strong transport departments that really have a lot of power to really implement the solutions and to manage all the different transport services in the city. If a transport department does not have as much power on how the city's transforming itself, it'd be really difficult to come up with new ideas on innovative transport solutions. And we are dealing with a few elements here in transport for the cities. We have the public transport, we have the private transport, non-motorized networks such as our pedestrian pathways, our bicycle network, and freight and logistics systems. And that's an important item to consider, especially in emerging economies where the urban freight is not being regulated. So we have buses and huge trucks coming during the peak hours in cities that really clog the system. Also trucks that are old, that are really pollutant. So we need to come up with new, basically, regulation and legislation to foster that optimization of resources and optimization of flows within cities. And all of this is to create a sustainable environment for our cities, sustainable in the way of social sustainability, economic sustainability, and also that environmental sustainability. So how do we make them together? For example, in Mexico, we have the units, we call them demand truck, that where a person may buy a truck and start providing public transport services. The authorities only provide like a license to operate the vehicles, but we have a plethora of this system, of these buses, that really create a lot of problems in cities because they are not being they're not operating in conjunction with each other. So we create an over supply. And also we don't integrate the operations in an efficient way. So that's a problem. But the way that it's been solved is by having an integrated system such as Metrobus or others, Transmilenio in Bogota, Optibus in Lyon. So those sorts of systems give rules, give control, give an efficient, and give clear financial and business models for your public transport systems. BRT systems, I know they are not completely adopted in many cities in the developed world. I know in the US they were trying to implement some BRT lines that got a little bit stopped in many locations. Just LA has one line, they're planning for more. But really this is a solution that is flexible and economically feasible for many cities, and they can create really high quality transport systems with low economic investments. So and another thing here is that we need to think about the entire transport system. So we have the administrative section. We need to program our services, define our routes, and this is mostly talking about planning for a good transport, public transport systems. We need to have a really clear financial schemes. This is very important in emerging economies where the public transport was not organized. So having these new systems that really regulates sort of the fare collection, having one single card that operates for the whole system. And this is something that is important for every city, right? Because when we think about mobility, we have a new concept coming afloat, which is the mobility as a service. Mobility has to provide service to citizens. We're not just having users of the public transport system, but clients. And as a client, we need to please, their needs, and having just a singular card to sort of pay for all the different transport modes that they may be using, that's very effective and efficient to sort of help the transport schemes. We need to also establish companies, and I'll go in more detail about this because in Mexico and Latin America, some of the transport operations get privatized. So the infrastructure is public, but the operations are private, and that happens also in other countries such as Spain and England and in the U.S., where sort of the infrastructure is a public thing, but the operation of the system gets privatized. So, and a whole new system. So when we talk about an integrated system, we're talking about having all the modes of transport really integrated into one singular agency that really understands how everything operates to optimize the use of all their vehicles, of their fleet, to optimize resources, optimize their staff, and really have an integrated plan and vision for the city, because we have very competitive or competing interests sometimes between the different transport agencies in a city, and specifically in a metropolitan city, because everybody has their own resources, they have their own way of managing, and really the most difficult and challenging thing for cities is to create one single agency that sort of helps operate everything. And you may think that's dangerous because it's a monopoly, but in a way we need to think about the interests of the city, and if it's a public resource that gets operated and managed from a public perspective, and also you integrate the private partnerships in a cohesive way, you can have a really strong system that really works for the city. And having a vision of sustainable transport in that agency is critical for the development of a city. So we think that integrated transport systems are the solution to many of these problems because they can plan the infrastructure, provide the services, provide the technology that is integrated in a fare collection system that integrates all these modes to provide really a multimodal solution to citizens. Having a multimodal solutions to citizens will foster a sustainable transport paradigm and will help people move faster and quicker. We have the planning of transport also. If it's integrated in one agency, you can define routes with better definition. You don't have to have competing routes. You have to define types of services. And all of this work may start working in an integrated department where all your transport agencies are sort of coordinated. I think that's the first step. If an agency can coordinate the efforts of all the other transport agencies into one single whole, that's one step. But if they don't share resources, if they don't share power, if they don't share a plan, then it's very difficult to achieve anything. So that's why it's important to sort of work together on that. When we think about services in transport, we're thinking about the structured routes, basically the subways, the BRT systems that are really structured. Then we have the busway connectors that may connect different cities, and they may use some of the busways to kind of go in, auxiliary services that connect different cities or different neighborhoods to the main structured routes, and the feeder routes that are also just to connect shorter trips to the main services. So when we think about all these concepts, I think Curitiba in Brazil has a very strong sense of how public transport systems need to work. Is one of the systems that is more robust and has integrated multiple types of services to provide a good way of moving people around. They have services, hospital services within their BRT system. They have school services for their BRT system. And they have all kinds of different auxiliary routes, auxiliary services that really provide that connection where origins and destinations are done. So to think about a financial scheme for an integrated transport systems that really works for sustainable transport, we need to create a system that it's very transparent in the way the resources get operated. Here is a picture of the Transmilenio system that really basically works with a way of integrating resources and paying the different operators accordingly to their services. So we have a political fare that is like sensitive to maybe some of the social environmental justice items, such as students or elderly populations. So, and then they may have a cheaper fare and the technical fare is really what the system costs. For example, in Mexico City, the subway system, it's the one fare, the technical fare, it's about $1.25 US dollars, but the actual fare that people pay is 50 cents. So we're seeing a huge gap that is not being met by the actual fare. So we are talking about subsidies, right? And subsidies in public transports are the norm. Most cities in the world are subsidizing public transport, and that may not be entirely bad, right? That's something that is a public service, a public good. So we need to do that, but we also need to think about mechanisms that really bring the public transport into a higher role where you don't have to be completely subsidized. You can do some sort of schemes where the operations are not subsidized, but infrastructure is, such as the systems in Transmilenio or the systems in Transantiago in Chile, where you have the infrastructure of BRT system or the infrastructure of public transport being provided by the federal government as a way of subsidy, but then the operations, how all the way from the drivers to who buys the buses to who pays for the gas, and so that's privatized. And then if you create a good public-private partnership, they can really help solve that problem of the fare, right? And so there is a couple of schemes that are working in different places in the world. The infrastructure is key. We need to think about sustainable infrastructure, such as BRT systems, subway systems, having a good way of integrating all these modes into the bus stops, into the integrated transfer facilities, and also having a good connecting system of bike sharing programs or even car sharing programs. I think San Francisco in the USA is doing a lot of really interesting things to integrate a whole set of mobility options. And really that's great, because the more mobility options you have for citizens, the better your city will be, the easier your people will get around. I think they're thinking about concepts of electric bike sharing, car sharing, carpooling. They have the new jitney services that are on demand and so on. So it's pretty interesting ecosystem of transport solutions that really invite people to get rid of that dependency on their car, because really we have multiplicity of options for moving around in a city that may be at times more efficient. I think here in, for example, our city here, Mexico, has a horrible congestion problem. So right now it's faster to move by bike than any other mode, even faster than a motorcycle. So we've got that multimodal challenge, and we see that really moving a car, it's about 30% longer or takes more time than moving with a bike. So really these concepts of integrated infrastructure really promote sustainable mobility in your cities. As you know, the technology, it's moving pretty fast, and the way we integrate technology into our transport system, it's critical for the good functioning and the good operations of our system. We need to think about control centers. We need to think about integrated operations. We need to think about understanding where our vehicles are. I think in Finland, I think Helsinki, the Helsinki Agency of Transport, has integrated into all their transport vehicles GPS systems that really understand where they're going, where they're coming from, and I think there is a couple of groups there in Finland, ITS Finland, that are doing really interesting things in really integrating all their technology with their fleet, with the transport fleet. So as a user, you can just pop up your app and determine where your vehicle is, how long your wait time is going to be. So that really helps the quality of the system and promotes people use the public transport system, and that kind of generates more kind of market, right? Because what you want to take is to take that market share that maybe in the automobile, in the single occupant vehicle, and bring it to our transport system. But in order to do that, we need to attract people with a really good system that is efficient, that is clean, that provides that quality of service. The fare collection technology is critical for a multimodal agency that provides just one singular card. Right here in Mexico, about 5 years ago, we had multiple cards, multiple types of fare collection. We have like, you would have to pay with cash, and we have to pay with a card, and you would have to buy like little tickets for different systems. So there was a whole movement to really come up with one singular card. We're not completely been operating that card through all the systems, but right now we have about 35% participation of the different transport systems. But that's the move, right? Moving toward just one singular card that operates with all the systems. Similar problem in New York City, where they still don't have a singular card for all their systems. You have the subway system, you have the train systems, you have the bus system. So they're also moving to an integrating one singular card. Really, there is a couple of cities that have achieved that. The case in point, it's in London, right, where they have achieved that singular fare collection system. But very few cities have one singular card for all their transport options. But really, that facilitates a lot of things. It's challenging because you have to think about the financial schemes, but it's worthwhile. Just an example here from my city, Mexico City, where we have various transport modes: Metrobus system, the subway system, the Transportes Eléctrico, which is the trolleybuses or the electric buses, and we have the typical RTP buses, just the regular buses with 50 passenger intake, and then we just have one singular train that takes you out into the outskirts of the city. But again, all these agencies are working independently. They're not working in coordination with each other, so that really creates a lot of problems in how they operate their system, because if they lack coordination, they may have redundant services, and if you have redundant services, then you have more vehicles on the system, and you're not optimizing your fleet. So when you think about integration of all these modes, you really have to think about how all they connect to each other, and have a good plan, have a good model that really comes up with that system. You may have a good plan in theoretically, but if you don't have the means and the mechanisms to integrate your modes, then you may not be able to achieve that sustainable mobility for your city. So we need to think about a clear legal framework. The branding of the system is a little important when you think about a multimodal transport system, because you need to integrate like a singular image for your system. I think in Los Angeles, California, LA Metro has moved very well into achieving that, right? Because they are starting to operate pretty much all of the public transport in the county of Los Angeles, and they have a few subway lines, they have train lines, they have light rail, they are now having lots of buses, they're having a BRT line, and they all have the same sort of image branding, which is contrary to what's happening in many cities, especially Latin American cities and Asian cities, where you have multiple different departments and so on, and you have a singular image, you have a singular fare collection. So you feel like I'm jumping from one system to the other. You have to pay different fares, and it gets really complicated for the user, right? But if you integrate the system, then you understand how your transfer stations will work, how you will connect all the different modes in a more optimized fashion. Communication is key. We need to think about how to make, as you may say, public transport cool, right? We need to make it cool, because if not, people will not be invited to do that. So there's different agencies that are making public transportation like a trending thing, right? But you have to come up with a communications to have an objective in mind to show that this is a sustainable way of moving around your city. So a couple of processes have to be implemented to bring that market that may be tied to single occupancy vehicles into the public transport. I mean, there are benefits for it, but you have to also provide a good sort of a good pitch, to those people that are tied to their cars, to sort of come up in and think about sustainability in that way. When you transform your agencies into a single coordinated agencies, you may have a lot of benefits. Some of these are here in this slide, where you connect and organize your city, you provide better quality of service, no overpassing. That's typical in emerging economies where you have competing services, and it's really sad to see why you have multiple transport lines in one singular avenue, that they're providing the same service, but because they're different sort of providers, then you have competing services. And that happened also, if you may remember, 100 years ago in New York City, where you have different subway agencies, and since they were private, they were competing with each other, and in a way it fostered to have a good network, but also at the same time sort of had competitive issues, the express trains and the non-express trains and so on, that later on it can consolidate into one single agency. but that's happening also in our emerging economies where you have multiple buses providing multiple services and it is redundant. So you need to integrate everything. Less travel time because you get rid of all those unutilized vehicles. Security, you need to train your drivers, to train your police to enforce the new regulations. You improve road safety, and we see that, for example, in the Metrobus line BRT here in Mexico City, from having 800 crashes a year before the BRT system got implemented, it went down to about 100 crashes a year. So we really see a huge improvement in road safety when you really coordinate all your bus system. Integrated fares, accessibility to the city, providing that access to people that may be impaired, either walk impairments or visual impairments. So that's really, really important. And sometimes that's not being considered in our emerging economies. So here is a quick item. Sorry, I apologize in Spanish. I think I couldn't translate this. It was an image, but we have 4 main components for a good integrated transport system, which is the technical component, the legal component, the financial component, and the communications component. These 4 components are the core elements to really create that agency that will integrate all the modes. So integrated transport system is a real challenge. You may be thinking about your own city, your own metropolitan region, and you may be thinking, oh, my neighbor next door, my municipality next door is not really want to go integrate and plan with us together and share resources. But really, it takes a lot of political will, and sometimes it's not your mayor or the people in charge of your municipality, but another sort of agency needs to coordinate the regional efforts. And that's the experience in some European countries, some U.S. countries where they create the metropolitan planning organizations or MPOs, where they coordinate the work of multiple agencies to plan. But that's still just one step too short, because you need to think about all the resources, sharing the planning, sharing all the responsibilities to operate your systems correctly. So we need a political will to create that, because if you don't do that, you may not have clear objectives. We need leadership, technical capacity. Many times, a lot of these new issues of transport, we don't have a lot of experts. If you start thinking about shared mobility concepts or other things, you may not have that capacity, technical capacity, to bring people on board. But that's important to start thinking about. Time. These processes take time. Creating an integrated transport system could take like 5 years. So you really need to think about long-term solutions, create resources, be them from a federal government agency, from your state government, from a local government, and strategic communication processes that sort of help create that good working group to create this integrated transport system, and just learn from others. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar, and I'm going to give a few minutes for questions or commentaries that people may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Gus. At this time, I'll just take the presenters' rights back. So now, just feel free at any time to raise your hand or to type a question. The floor is yours for any questions that you might have related to sustainable public transport and integrated transport in cities. And we'd also like to hear about what the situation is like in your city. If you have an interesting case example or anything you'd like to discuss on a more local level, that would also be interesting for discussion. Okay. So we have a question from Joseph Francis Kelly. So I will unmute you right now, and the floor is yours. You can ask your question. Hello? Joseph, you had raised your hand. If you have a question, then I've unmuted your microphone. You can ask your question at any time. Or if, since we can't hear you, you could also type it, and then I can ask the question on your behalf. Yeah, I don't think it's working. I'll mute again. Okay. Or if there's anything else that you would like to add, Gus, in the meantime, perhaps some more discussion around, since most of our participants are from Europe, if there's anything you'd like to highlight in terms of transferability of this topic within Europe, or?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to hear from. I know some of the, at least I know in some parts of Germany, some of the smaller cities started to get closer and closer together because of the urbanization. So these cities start to get closer, but there's not a singular agency that plans and operates for this sort of disparate municipalities. So I don't know if they're thinking about how they're thinking transport planning for those areas. I know for the bigger cities in Europe, they're pretty integrated and they're like they're compact, so which helps. But some of these more kind of sprawling cities that we see all over the world, how are they integrated their plan and how they operate their system? I think that'll be interesting to hear.
Absolutely. Well, we do have some more poll questions that we did not get to launch, and actually one of them might be interesting for finding out what types of modes your city does have and are being organized in your city. So we can launch this poll right now and then maybe have a discussion around that. So it should be launched. Here we go. For some reason, I don't see the window.
I see it.
You do see it. Okay. All right. 33% have voted. So this is just asking, does your city have a subway, train, BRT? You can tick more than one, obviously. Since
if they don't have, I guess that'll be the remaining percentage.
Perhaps. Yeah, right now we have 61% that have voted. And I will close the poll and then share the results. Okay. Are you seeing the results? Because I am not. Okay.
30%, 36% subway, 73% train, and 9% BRT. Okay, that's great. So that's
yeah.
But I'm imagining that the train system is more not an urban transport system, but more to bring people from other cities into the city, or is it a light rail system? I mean, that'll be interesting because typically trains help a lot the regional connectivity, but at least for some of the more compact cities, it's typically subway or light rail. Light rail could be the one.
Yeah. Yeah, these results aren't too surprising considering most participants are coming from Europe. So, yeah, train is definitely dominating, I would say. BRT, not so much. That's definitely more predominant in the Central and South American context, I would say, and also in China.
Yeah, and that's a good discussion because I think some cities in emerging economies, even in the U.S., are thinking about where to invest their dollars, either in train subways or BRTs. And typically people think that the trains or subway systems are the way to go because they are a more robust and more long-term system. But really the costs of those are 10 times higher at times than a BRT infrastructure. So that's a challenge, right? So that's why we see that emerging economies, mainly for a cost-benefit analysis, they go for the BRT route. But maybe the BRT is not the solution, right? Because you may not have the capacity. A BRT, if it's operated in optimal level, you could move about, like in Jakarta or other places, they're moving about 40,000 people per hour in one singular section of BRT, which that's a lot. But that's because they have like two busways running in parallel to each other and so on and so forth. So it takes a lot of space. But a train could do that with less space and in a more efficient and more sustainable fashion as well. So there are those difficult questions. I think Bogota right now is dealing with that with their new subway in Bogota. They're having some discussions and on that's a discussion they've been having for almost 20 years, I think. But I think they're moving towards choosing the subway in their city.
Mm. Yeah, and I know that BRT is definitely being discussed a lot more in the U.S. now, especially with such tight transport budgets at the city level. The city of Philadelphia, where I'm from, I know that there used to be a very extensive trolley network, and that was basically cut mostly out of the system as of the early 60s, and so now they're actually discussing reactivating these lines, but with BRT. And I think the South American context, those case examples really shine as good examples of how to organize effective BRT and get really high ridership.
Right. Good. Did we have another question for the poll?
No questions yet. Nobody has typed anything. If you have any last burning questions, we'll be here for about another 5 minutes. So please do type your questions or raise your hand. Just make sure that your microphone will be working if you want to speak a question. Comments are welcome as well. If you'd like to add any information from your local context, then we invite you to do so. So we'll just give it another minute or two if you'd like to think of any questions. Otherwise, then we can wrap up. We can hide these full results. Okay. We do have one typed question here, so that's good. So this is from Joseph, who had raised his hand earlier. So he says, yeah, his facilities were temporarily disabled. So he has designed BRT and LRT for Galway, Ireland. And this is in counter to a highway solution here by the road lobby. However, he's found that BRT may be the best compromise with authorities in a high car usage society. That's also relevant in, as I was saying, in the U.S., so that's a good point. And then he also says, is this the best approach to try and implement an incremental public transport system?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Because we need to face little by little our transport systems. I think when you think about our budgets for transport, and you think about all the need for to provide a good, effective transport solution, I think you have to start small and start with a small project that is going to be very impactful, and it's going to show the benefits of either a BRT line or some other public transport infrastructure that be really effective. So you really have to think strategically, very carefully on what's the most impactful corridor for a BRT line, and typically that's been done correctly in most cities, but we've also had some disasters, especially in Latin America, where a BRT line was not chosen accordingly, and they miscalculated the demand. They thought that it was going to be about 200,000 people using it per day, but it ended up being like less than half than that, and that's happened a couple of times. So that creates sort of a bad effect, right? People don't want to do it again because it's a failure. So you really have to choose the right project at the right time and put the right means to make it really, really sort of stellar. So that sort of promotes and sort of keeps growing your system. So that's key, and having a good communication for the system, inviting the people to use it. I think that's also really key and critical for a good project.
So it sounds like it requires some really thorough market research in the beginning, and then some really good marketing at the during the implementation.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Joseph also says the BRT and LRT system is called SUIG, and I have designed an integrated regional model with Limerick and Cork along the west coast of Ireland. So it's interesting. We'll have to look into this case study.
That's great. Yeah, I need to look into Ireland more. I know they're doing some interesting things in transport. So yeah.
Yeah. No, it's very good. Thank you very much, Joseph. Okay. Good. So I invite any last questions. We just have a couple more minutes. So just let us know if you have a question. You can also raise your hand. Okay. We do have one more question. It's related to if this will be available as a file afterwards, and yes, it will. We're recording this webinar, and we will upload it on our YouTube channel. So I actually have that information. We can wrap up the webinar now. And so if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We have our emails here. And also, all presentations, as I said, will be uploaded to our website in the form of a PDF or the PowerPoint, and the recordings will be on YouTube. If you are interested in light electric vehicles for cleaner cities, this will be our final webinar in the Solutions series of webinars, and that will be held on Tuesday, December 8th, again from 3 to 4 p.m. Central European Time. And our presenter will be Annick Rotink, Light Electric Vehicle Policy Manager at Vera, the European Association for Battery, Hybrid, and Fuel Cell Electric Vehicles. So we invite you to register for that. You can register on our website. And I'll just say thank you very much for joining us today for this 1-hour webinar. And we wish you a pleasant rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you, Gus. Thanks. Bye-bye.